Hi, and welcome to Parashat Ki Tetzeh. And in this parasha, we ask the fundamental question: how is it possible that the Torah could authorize and allow for a soldier to have sexual relationship with a prisoner of war, a female prisoner of war, even if she's married? How does Torah condone that? We're going to discuss that. But first, let's understand that this parasha is full of great subjects. It ranges from the captive women that we mentioned, the firstborn rights, wayward son, all about property, wearing female clothing, whether that's allowed for a man to do, sending away the mother bird from the nest, having a protective fence on your roof, the tzitzit, the formation of married women, adultery, forbidden marriages, sanctity of the camp, the escaped slave, sexual purity, interest, not charging interest on loans to Jews, vows to Hashem, a worker's right to eat, divorce, remarriage, kidnapping, slander, dignity of the debtor, timely payments of the workers, gifting to the poor from the corners of your harvest, lashes, levirate marriage, having honest weights and measures, and remembering Amalek. I mean, wow. That is a huge list for one parasha. We're going to do our best to cover as much as we can. Let's start with this idea that you can have sexual relationship with a captive prisoner. And this is an example of the Torah understanding human frailty and the failure of man. And it's not that it's condoning this action. And when it says Ki Tetzeh lemelchama, many of the commentators, including the Alshas, says it's not talking necessarily about going out to war. It's talking about the internal war that we all face with our biggest enemy, the Yetzer Hara. His job is to make sure that we do not fulfill our life mission here in this world. He wants to kill us at all costs. And we have to be extremely careful and clever in our fight against the Yetzer Hara. And ultimately, the Torah is saying that it may be better to lose the battle if it enables you to win the war. And the Torah says that a soldier is faced with four intrinsic urges that might force him to undertake such an act. The first is that he might be curious to taste something new. The second is that he might be seduced by the prisoner's clothing or jewelry. The third is a psychological reaction to the natural fears of laws and the feeling that once the danger is over and you're in safety, a certain permissiveness comes in to allow you to do things that you wouldn't normally want to do. And fourthly, you want to gain pleasure from your share of the loot that was acquired. So the Torah devises four methods of action whose aim is to win the war against the Yetzer Hara. Firstly, you have to bring her to your house. As it says in verse 12, Vehaveta el toch betecha. That way you get used to her presence and then she's no longer an object of curiosity of tasting something new. You have to give her plain clothes, take her out of the clothes that she used to wear, no jewelry, and this is to take away the lure that the clothing and the jewelry had on the soldier. And you bring it to the house, the idea is that there shall be complete conflict between her and your wife. You're allowed to have two wives at that stage. Something that, thank goodness, we are not allowed to practice today. But in this friction between the two women, you see that this is no longer a prized acquisition, but it's in fact a big burden. And instead of experiencing the joy of having her in your home, you're experiencing the strife of having two women quarreling. And it's very interesting how the Torah describes it, that it's almost like an instruction that the captive women should cry for a month. How can you force somebody to cry for a month? And the Alshas said that this is actually a prediction, not a command. It's a prediction because the captive woman will no longer have the clothes and the jewelry that she had when she was at home, and she will be constantly facing the jealousy of the wife, and that will cause her to miss the love that she enjoyed at home, and that will surely make her cry. And the verse 13 where it says, Uvachta et avia ve'et ima yerach yamim, this is a prediction and not a command. And have a look at the consequence of these four procedures. In verse 14 it says, Vehaya, and it shall be that if you do not desire her, then you should send her away on her own. Vehaya is an indication of joy, and so who's joyful? It's actually the heavens are joyful that the prescription given to this soldier worked and he no longer desired this prisoner of war. The 4 measures indeed cooled off his libido. He became disenchanted about his captive and cut relations with her. But notice that there was spiritual damage as well as physical damage for allowing himself to succumb to his passion in the way he did. The spiritual damage is the fact that he lost the battle against the Yetzer Hara and allowed himself to engage in physical pleasures. But what is the material damage? Fascinatingly, the Torah says he can no longer sell the slave. He has to let her go. Whereas if he didn't indulge sexually with her, he would have been allowed to sell her and enjoy the financial benefit of that. So the physical damage is that he's lost the right to sell her as a slave, something that he would have had the right to do had he not slept with her in the first place. Now let's turn to verse 15. Ki tiena leish shete nashim. If a man will have 2 wives, one beloved and one hated. There's no coincidence that this comes straight after the first scenario, because the Alsha says this is actually a consequence of indulging physically, is that you will have 2 wives, one that you hate and one that you don't. And this is the Torah warning that if you taste something forbidden, then even the good that one experienced on the hand of Hashem will feel bitter to you. And the firstborn son from the hated first wife becomes the one that will become the Bechor, and you have no right as a father to change which son has the Bechor, even if you want to give it to the favored wife. It's not in your ability to do that. And the big lesson here is that if you imagine the bitterness that this resulted from something that the Torah on paper allowed you to do, then just imagine the bitterness that we will face by doing the things that we're specifically asked not to do, that the Yetzer Hara might encourage us to do anyway. And here the Alsha says the famous vort that Isha and Ish, that Ish is spelled Aleph Yud Shin and Isha is spelled Aleph Shin Hey. Between them they have the U and the Hey, which is the letters for Hashem. If you take that out, if you remove the spiritual context of their marriage, then you're left with 2 letters in each case, Aleph and Shin, which is the word for Esh, fire. Meaning that if you take God out of your life, then you will be consumed by the fire that your natural physical passion has brought you to. And now we continue in verse 18 with the wayward son. If you will have a wayward son or rebellious son, Ki yeh lecha ben sorer u'morer. And the Alsha says that sorer is a reference to your poor character traits, and morer is a reference to the people that you're going to be influencing, your peers, by your negative behavior. And King David's friend Husha Arki, the Alsha says, suggested that his son Avshalom, who tried to kill him, this whole incident of Avshalom wanting to kill his father was the consequence of King David's union with his mother, a captive prisoner of war. And notice, ki hiye leish, if there is to the father a wayward son, it's not called to the mother, because the Alsha says if he did not marry the prisoner of war, then he wouldn't have produced a wayward son. So the Torah blames the father squarely for this creation of the wayward son and not the converted mother. And this is a great lesson on parenting, because the Torah says that if you don't discipline your child when they're young, what chances do you have of disciplining them when they're older? Do you think at that stage they will respond positively to your disciplining and restricting their freedom? And the Torah says in that situation, which by the way is very, very rare, I don't think there's ever a case of a child sorero merer who was put to death. But in that hypothetical situation, the Torah says it's more important to wipe that individual out and maintain and retain the moral structure of the Jewish nation as a whole. And as you can see, the whole chain of events started because the father initially could not restrain himself from physical pleasure when he was on the battlefield. So the important thing here is, again, not that the Torah condones this, but the Torah understands that it's better to lose the battle against the Yetzer Hara in this particular case and not lose the war. The important thing from the Torah's perspective is not to make this fall a permanent occurrence in your life, but rather to make it a one-off error that you manage to overcome as a result of the 4 procedures that the Torah prescribes. And as we know, the human mind can rationalize almost anything. So don't imagine that you can make the following argument, and that is that, let me rescue this lost Gentile soul and bring them close to the truth of the Torah. After all, aren't all the children of the world children of Hashem? And after all, didn't Moshe himself introduce and bring in the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, into the Jewish camp without seeking the permission of Hashem? And we all know what resulted in that era. The golden calf and almost every negative incident that happened in the desert could have been put towards the influence of the Erev Rav. And the next chapter, 22, talks about lost property. And don't think that rescuing the prisoner of war, the female prisoner of war, has anything to do with returning her to her owner. Because if it's true that it's God himself that fights the war for us, then she becomes the prisoner of war of God, not yours. So don't think that you're rescuing her on behalf of God. And there's a beautiful lesson here in chapter 22, all to do with returning lost property. Because the Torah starts with, love your neighbor like yourself. This is not a very natural characteristics to perform. But when you read the progression of the Torah, you will see that one mitzvah produces the other. What happens when you love your neighbor like yourself is that you will be inclined to return a lost property to that neighbor when it's a kosher animal. And once you've done that, you'll be more inclined to return the lost property of a non-kosher animal. And once you've done that, you're more inclined to return the property of a clothing of your neighbor, which is an inanimate object. And then finally we have the law of shooing the mother bird, and this is the final result of the domino effect of chesed, that you will end up shooing the mother bird who is ownerless, and you're performing this mitzvah completely altruistically. There's no benefit for you to do that. And these laws of returning a lost object is basically to train us to do chesed, even though we're not the immediate beneficiary of that chesed. And now let's turn to verse 8 and 9. These 2 verses seem completely unrelated, but have a look at what the Alshach says. Verse 8 says that if you build a new house, you should make a fence on the roof so that you do not place blood in your house if a fallen one falls from it. Verse 9 says, you will not sow your vineyard with a mixture, lest the growth of the seeds that you plant and produce of the vineyard becomes forbidden. And the Alshach says that if somebody, God forbid, falls from your roof because you haven't put a fence, to what extent are you responsible? Could you not assume that the person falling had it in their mazal to fall? And the Alshach suggests that they might not have had sufficient negative merits to warrant them to fall from the roof, but your negligence by not putting a fence was enough to tip that over, and as a result they died. And so to what extent are you responsible for their death? And what is the offense of growing 2 species together? What harm could that possibly do? And the Alshach says that the connection between the 2 is that in the same way that we cannot fathom the extent of our fault with regards to the fence, we cannot understand Hashem's calculation as to why sowing 2 species together would have a negative effect. And how can we understand this verse 12, which says when it comes to making fringes on the corners of your garments, you are allowed to mix wool and linen together, different species, for the purpose of this mitzvah? How can that be? And the Alshach says that sometimes bringing 2 different species together has the effect of purifying each one, because of the discomfort that each experiences by the presence of the other. And chapter 23 verse 4 is all about who's allowed to become part of the Jewish nation and who is not. And why is it that Ammonites and Moabites, who are descendants of Lot, who was the nephew of Avram, why is it that we're not allowed to marry them? And yet the Mitzrim, who persecuted us and made our lives so bitter, we are allowed. And the Alsha suggests that the reason why we're not to be concerned with the wealth of the descendants of the Ammonites and Moabites, the descendants of Lot, is because of ingratitude to what Avram did to Lot. There was no need for Avram to risk his life to rescue Lot from the 4 kings that took him from Zidon. And instead of being grateful, their descendants tried to seduce the Jewish people to pray to idols. On the other hand, the Egyptians, who did make our lives a misery, did allow us to come in and partake in their foods during the famine, when there was no food in Egypt or Canaan. And so their allowing us to stay in their country became a life-saving act to us. And we have to show gratitude to them for giving our forefathers refuge in their country during the famine. And now let's turn to verse 10. When a camp goes out against your enemies, Ki Tetzeh machane al oivecha. And the Alsha says that if you are ungrateful to another human being, you will end up being ungrateful to God. An example of this is like Pharaoh, who refused to acknowledge what Joseph had done to the Egyptians in Egypt, ends up later refusing to acknowledge God. And since when Israel goes to war, it's Hashem that's actually doing the fighting for us. It's very important that we are given laws to retain and keep the purity and sanctity of the camp even during warfare. And even matters that are not impure themselves intrinsically, like excrement, human excrement, have to be covered so that the camp retains its purity and doesn't drive away Hashem's presence from us. And such a holy camp has 2 elements of the holiness. One is the holiness of the Bnei Israel, and the other one is the holiness of God, who is amongst us and fighting for us. And we should be ever conscious of that when we are going about our affairs in the camp. And finally, let's turn to this idea that a Jew cannot charge interest to another Jew, and yet it's perfectly acceptable to charge interest to a non-Jew. How do we rationalize that? And the Yashar says that when you take an interest-bearing loan, that you will end up selling your produce in order to pay off the creditor, and when that finishes, you'll frantically look around for other assets that you can give them to get the creditors of your back. And in fact, an interest-bearing loan does not enhance the economic state of the borrower. In fact, the opposite. It removes the borrower from economic stability. So if that's the case, why is it possible, in fact mandatory, for Jews to charge interest to non-Jews? And here the Al-Sheikh suggests that this is because there's a fundamental difference in the philosophies of the Jewish person and the non-Jewish. On the whole, Gentiles believe in mazalot, hashgacha klalit, predetermination of luck. This philosophy by nature limits the scope of powers you're attributing to the creator of the world. Jews, on the other hand, believe in a totally free creator, hashgachat pratit, personal divine providence. And a clear example of that is what God did for us to take us out of Egypt. Something completely unnatural and unprecedented in the history of the world. Jews believe that God, our God, can make the poor rich and impoverish the rich at will. And the Alsha quotes a beautiful passage from the Gemara, Ta'anit 8, which says that if you're a farmer that has a barn and you came to count the size of the crop after your harvest, there's a special bracha, a special blessing you can say. He who extends blessing on this heap. And the fascinating rule about this is that if you have already counted your crop, you cannot retrospectively say this blessing. You can only recite it before you make the counting. And that is because Hashem does not extend His blessing on something that has been counted already by human eyes. And then there's a most profound lesson in this, and I hope you hear it, and that is that it is not Hashem but man who restricts Hashem's blessing to come down on us by believing that it's our own work and hishtadlut only that is the cause of our financial stability. And a Jew who charges interest to another Jew demonstrates his belief that his economic wealth will follow a measured and predictable path, leaving no room for the Creator to give his additional blessings. Such a person loses his faith in the freedom of the Creator to do his will, and will end up not feeling grateful to the Creator for the wealth that he's acquired, and instead ascribe it to his own success. And for the Jew, there's hardly anything that conflicts more directly with this basic principle of faith. And this led to the sages stigmatizing a Jew who charges interest to another Jew by saying that such a person cannot refer to the God of Israel as his God, since that he has denied him such a central platform of Jewish faith. And that's it for Parashat Ki Tetzeh. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I would like to leave you with this bracha. That in the ultimate war that we have with our Yetzer Hara, it's okay to lose a battle if ultimately that will lead to you winning the war. And in fact, be aware that the Yetzer Hara, the Satan's one of his greatest tools, is to make us feel guilty about the battle that we lost against him, and keep our consciousness embedded in that regret, rather than allowing us to lift ourselves up to better and greater things in our lives. And that is why they say the sign of a great sage is not that he fell, we all fall. The sign of a great sage is how quickly do you get up. May we always get up quickly, efficiently, and cleanly from all the things we allow ourselves to fall in. Wishing you Shabbat Shalom, God bless, and see you next week.